There was a time when people believed that talent was something that developed slowly over years of practice and training. But then, there was a man who came along and made everyone question that idea. He didn't come from a well-known family of musicians. He wasn't trained in any famous conservatories. Yet, he stepped into the spotlight and played the piano in a way that stunned even the most experienced professionals. It all started on an ordinary evening in Vienna. At one of the most famous concert halls in the world, the audience was expecting nothing out of the ordinary, but what they got was extraordinary. A man, young, unknown, and quiet, walked onto the stage, sat at the grand piano, and began to play. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the room seemed to hold its breath. The music flowed effortlessly, weaving through the hall like a stream, so beautiful, so flawless, that the crowd sat in stunned silence. When the piece ended, the applause was immediate, but it wasn't just the usual polite clapping. This was a standing ovation, a rare and powerful thing. People couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. How could someone who had never been on the public stage before play so perfectly, so emotionally? The music was full of depth, technical precision, and soul. Everything you would expect from a pianist who had spent years studying under the best teachers in the world. But this pianist, had no such background. At least that's what he told the media. The man's name was soon on everyone's lips. He became an instant sensation, a piano genius as the media dubbed him. Articles started popping up everywhere. Interviews were lined up and concert invitations flooded in. Within weeks, he was the hottest topic in classical music. Critics who had seen it all and heard it all were left speechless. How had this man with no known history come to play the piano as if he had been born for it? The more people learned about him, the more questions seemed to arise. His name, his story, and his background, nothing added up. There were no records of him as a child prodigy. No reports of him performing anywhere, not even a local concert hall before that night in Vienna. It was as if he had appeared from thin air. He spoke very little about his past, choosing to focus entirely on his music. The more he played, the more people asked, who was he really? Rumors began to swirl. Some believed that his sudden appearance was no accident. Was it possible that this man was not who he said he was? Perhaps he was an imposter, someone pretending to be a genius for fame and fortune. His ability to capture the attention of the world so quickly seemed almost too perfect. No one could deny his skill on the piano. But were the questions surrounding his identity a sign of something darker? Was he a true genius, or was he just incredibly good at pretending? Meanwhile, fans and critics were divided. Some couldn't care less about his past. They loved his music, and that was all that mattered. To them, it didn't matter if he had studied at a conservatory or not. What mattered was that he could play. Others, however, felt uneasy. There was something unsettling about how little they knew about him. How could someone be this good without the kind of training that other great pianists had gone through? It wasn't long before a few musicians, especially those who had spent their lives in the world of classical music, began to express doubts. One of them, a well-respected concert pianist, noticed something strange. When she listened to his performances, she heard echoes of famous pianists from the past. The way he played certain pieces reminded her of a particular style, almost like he was borrowing from someone else. It was subtle, but it was there. She couldn't ignore it. Could it be that he was simply mimicking someone else's playing style? Was he really creating these performances on his own? Or was he simply copying the greats? Despite these growing concerns, the media continued to celebrate him as a genius. He was in demand everywhere, performing on stage, appearing on TV shows, and being interviewed by top journalists. It seemed like the world couldn't get enough of him. But there were still those who couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The more they learned about his story, the more questions piled up. One of the most puzzling things about him was how little anyone knew about his life before his rise to fame. There were no childhood pictures of him with a piano, no stories of him practicing for hours on end, no teachers who could say they had mentored him. The more people tried to dig into his past, the more it seemed like he had popped out of nowhere. People began to wonder, was this young man a musical prodigy, or was he simply a well-trained actor playing a role? A few music critics started to dig deeper. They began to search for clues in his performances. They listened carefully, trying to find signs that he was imitating someone else's work. And the more they searched, the more they started to find strange similarities with the music of a long-forgotten pianist who had disappeared years ago. This pianist, Lucas Kavanaugh had been a well-known figure in the music world years before Alexei's rise to fame. But Kavanaugh had vanished from the public eye under mysterious circumstances. No one knew where he had gone, or if he had stopped playing altogether. His compositions were still talked about, but they had never quite caught on in the way that some of the other great musicians' works had. As more and more people dug into Alexei's past, they began to wonder, was it possible that Alexei was really Lucas Kavanaugh? Had he somehow disappeared from the public eye only to return under a new name, pretending to be a fresh young talent? Or was Alexei a completely different person? Someone who had simply studied Kavanaugh's music so thoroughly that his style seemed eerily similar. Despite all the questions and the rumors, Alexei never addressed the accusations directly. He continued to perform, to mesmerize audiences, and to turn down interviews that focused too much on his past. He always kept the spotlight on his music, and as long as he played, the crowd loved him. But in the background, the whispers kept growing. There were more and more people who began to wonder if they had been tricked. The story of the piano genius was starting to feel less like a fairy tale and more like a mystery that needed to be solved. Could he be the real deal? Or was he just a clever imposter playing a part that was too good to be true? As the controversy grew, so did Alexei's fame. With every concert, more and more people came to see the young pianist. But with every new performance, the doubt grew stronger. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Was he really a genius, or was he just an expert imitator? And the more people watched him play, the harder it became to tell. For now, the world was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But in the back of their minds, there was a nagging feeling that this story wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Alexei had become a mystery that everyone wanted to solve. The mystery surrounding the young pianist, now known as the piano genius, began to grow with each passing day. People couldn't stop talking about him, but as the world celebrated his talent, more and more people started to ask difficult questions. Where had he come from? Who was he really? The more attention he gained, the more scrutiny followed, and that only seemed to make the puzzle even harder to solve. Alexei was more than willing to step into the spotlight. He had embraced his fame wholeheartedly, accepting invitations to concerts, interviews, and TV appearances. But when it came to talking about his past, he kept a tight lid on things. He would answer questions with vague comments, brushing off anything that felt too personal. It was clear he wasn't eager to share the details of his early life. For someone who could play the piano with such raw emotion and skill, it seemed odd that he would be so guarded about something as simple as his upbringing. Most of the public believed in the magic of his music. They were enchanted by the way his fingers danced across the keys, creating sounds that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. But there were always a few who found something unsettling about the whole situation. How could someone so good, so fast, become famous without any real history? Was he hiding something, or had he simply emerged out of nowhere? A rare talent that no one had discovered before. The first cracks in Alexei's story began to show when a music journalist decided to dig deeper. He had heard rumors about Alexei's mysterious past and was determined to find out the truth. The journalist made phone calls, sent emails, and tried to track down anyone who might know something about the young pianist's life before he appeared on the world stage. What he uncovered wasn't exactly what he expected. There were no childhood photographs of Alexei with a piano, no early recordings of him playing, no stories of him winning local competitions or even performing at small gatherings. It was as though his life before that night in Vienna had been erased. In fact, the journalist discovered that no one could really recall ever hearing about him before he showed up in the concert hall that night. Not one person could say they knew him as a child or a young man or even an aspiring musician. This discovery was a red flag, but it wasn't enough to draw any hard conclusions. After all, there were plenty of talented people who had simply never been in the public eye before. Maybe Alexei had spent years practicing in private, away from the world, and was now ready to share his gift. It wasn't impossible. But as the journalist kept digging, he started to uncover even stranger details. He found an old video from years ago, something no one seemed to have noticed. It was grainy and blurry, but the person in the video was unmistakably Alexei. The video showed him playing a piano piece, but there was something strange about it. His playing was good, certainly, but it didn't have the same brilliance, the same effortless quality that he displayed now. It was as if he was still learning, still figuring things out. The playing was competent, but not world-changing. What caught the journalist's attention even more, though, was the style of the piece Alexei was playing. It was familiar, too familiar. The more the journalist listened to the video, the more he realized that the piece wasn't something that Alexei had written himself. It wasn't something he had even created. It was a composition by a long-forgotten pianist, someone who had been well known in the classical music world years earlier but had disappeared without a trace. The pianist in question was Lucas Cavanaugh, a name that had faded into obscurity over time. Lucas had been known for his unique style, a blend of passion and precision that had earned him a loyal following. But just as he seemed poised to break into the global spotlight, he vanished. No one knew where he went or why he stopped performing. His compositions were left behind, and over time people began to forget about him. That is, until this video surfaced. The piece Alexei was playing was nearly identical to one that Lucas had composed before he disappeared. The melody, the rhythm, even the way the notes were arranged, they were unmistakably Lucas's work. The journalist couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was it possible that Alexei wasn't the genius everyone thought he was? Could it be that he had been imitating Lucas all along, taking credit for someone else's work? If that was true, then Alexei wasn't a new, fresh talent at all. He was simply a skilled performer who had studied Lucas's music in secret and was now passing it off as his own. But how could this be? How could a pianist who was supposedly self-taught, someone with no formal training, know about Lucas Cavanaugh and his forgotten compositions? The more the journalist thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. He dug deeper into Lucas's story and found out that Lucas had disappeared around the same time that Alexei had supposedly started his piano journey. The timing seemed suspicious, and there was something else. Alexei had never mentioned Lucas or any of the older composers who might have influenced his playing. It was as if he had erased an entire chapter of musical history from his own story. Now the question was clear. Was Alexei really who he said he was? Or was he hiding the truth about how he had come to master the piano so quickly? The journalist decided to track down anyone who might know more about Lucas Cavanaugh, hoping to uncover some hidden connection between the two men. As the investigation continued, more and more people began to ask similar questions. A few musicians who had once worked with Lucas Cavanaugh on his early compositions began to remember strange things. They recalled how Lucas had been intensely private, always keeping his compositions to himself. But there had been whispers at the time about someone close to Lucas, someone who had taken a keen interest in his work. Could Alexei have been that person? Had he been a student of Lucas's? Or perhaps someone who had studied his music in secret? If Alexei had truly known Lucas and had copied his work, then that would explain the striking similarities between their playing styles. The whole situation was beginning to look like an elaborate puzzle. On the one hand, Alexei had built a reputation as a virtuoso, captivating audiences with his technical brilliance and emotional depth. But on the other hand, there were these troubling signs that suggested he wasn't quite as original as everyone had thought. In a world where the pursuit of perfection often comes with a price, Alexei's story was becoming more complicated by the day. Was he a true genius, a musician whose talent had bloomed out of nowhere? Or was he simply an expert imitator, using the work of a forgotten composer to create the illusion of brilliance? The lines were starting to blur. For now, Alexei remained silent, keeping his past hidden from public view. He continued to perform, each concert earning him new admirers and more fame. The world wanted to believe in him, to believe that he was a once-in-a-lifetime talent. But behind the applause, the whispers were getting louder. Was the world being duped? Or had they really discovered a new musical prodigy? The truth, it seemed, was still just out of reach. And so the mystery continued. The world was left to wonder whether the pianist on stage was truly a genius, or a man with a secret. The deeper the investigation went, the more complicated everything seemed. The questions surrounding Alexei's past were no longer just whispers in the background. They were growing louder, clearer, and more urgent. The journalist who had first uncovered the old video of Alexei playing a piece by Lucas Cavanaugh didn't stop there. He knew he had to go further. He was on the trail of something big, something that could shake the very foundation of Alexei's rise to fame. At first, the journalist thought he might be overthinking things. After all, it wasn't impossible for a young pianist to emerge out of nowhere and play with incredible skill. But as the pieces of the puzzle started to align, He couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. How could a man who had no public history suddenly play with such precision, such depth, without any training or experience? How had Alexei gone from an unknown figure to one of the most famous musicians in the world in such a short amount of time? The journalist wasn't alone in his suspicions. One of the top music critics, who had been attending Alexei's concert since his debut, started to question the authenticity of his performances. The critic, who had seen many famous pianists in their prime, noticed something odd in the way Alexei played. It wasn't that his performances were bad, they were extraordinary. But there was something strange in the way Alexei approached certain pieces, especially the ones that Lucas Kavanaugh had been known for. There was a familiarity in his style, a kind of echo, as if Alexei were trying to bring something from the past into the present. The music critic wasn't the only one who felt this way. As more people started to dig into Alexei's past, more and more questions arose. No one could find any proof of his childhood. No teachers, no competitions, no records of him playing in local piano clubs or talent shows. There were no family members or childhood friends who could speak about him. It was as if Alexei had appeared out of nowhere, as though he had simply materialized one day to play for the world. The journalist began calling around, asking anyone who might have known something about Alexei before he became famous. The more he called, the more unsettling the answers became. A former piano teacher in a small town in Russia mentioned that she had briefly taught a student named Alexei when he was young, but the teacher was quick to add that he had never shown any exceptional talent. She described him as average at best, with no real passion for the piano. His parents had been strict but quiet, and he had no interest in performing. He was just a boy who happened to play the piano, but nothing special about him stood out. This was a far cry from the polished, confident performer the world now knew. As the investigation deepened, another surprising discovery was made. Someone who had known Alexei in his teenage years came forward. She claimed that Alexei had been a quiet, reserved young man who spent most of his time alone. According to her, he had once told her about a pianist named Lucas Kavanaugh, someone he admired deeply. But there was more. Alexei had mentioned that he had found old recordings of Kavanaugh's music and had been working on them in secret. She had assumed it was just a hobby, something to pass the time. At the time, she had no idea just how seriously Alexei took it. This new information made the journalist wonder, could Alexei have been studying Lucas Kavanaugh's music in private, perfecting it until he was ready to perform it for the world? It wasn't impossible. In fact, it seemed like the most likely explanation. But if that was the case, why had Alexei never mentioned Kavanaugh? Why had he never talked about the pianist whose style seemed to have influenced so much of his own? To get to the bottom of this mystery, the journalist turned to an expert in classical music, a professor who had studied Kavanaugh's work extensively. The professor agreed to meet and discuss the situation, though he was cautious in his opinions. He admitted that Kavanaugh's music had never really received the attention it deserved. It was unique, full of raw emotion, but it had never captured the public's interest in the way other great composers had. However, the professor also acknowledged that Kavanaugh's compositions were known for their complexity and emotional depth, which were qualities that seemed to mirror Alexei's performances. The professor listened to a few of Alexei's more recent recordings and nodded thoughtfully. There's no doubt that Alexei is playing these pieces with incredible skill, he said, but there's something familiar about his approach to them. The phrasing, the pauses, even the way he adds certain flourishes, these are things Kavanaugh was known for. It's possible that Alexei has studied Kavanaugh's work in great detail, and if that's the case, it could explain how he's developed such a deep understanding of Kavanaugh's music. The journalist felt like he was getting closer to the truth. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Had Alexei really learned all of Kavanaugh's music in private, or was there something else going on? The more he learned, the more it seemed like Alexei had been hiding something from the world. Around the same time, a major concert promoter who had worked with Alexei for several months started to have his own doubts. He had been present at a number of Alexei's private rehearsals and had witnessed something strange. Alexei would often play pieces in ways that didn't quite match the written sheet music. He would add notes, change the tempo, and make slight adjustments that weren't in the original compositions. At first, the promoter assumed it was just Alexei's unique interpretation of the music, a creative choice that many great artists made. But as the promoter paid closer attention, He started to notice that these changes were often very similar to the way Lucas Kavanaugh had played his own pieces. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like Alexei was adapting Kavanaugh's music rather than composing it himself. The promoter began to ask around, and soon discovered that others had noticed the same thing. There were whispers that Alexei wasn't the true creator of the music he was playing, but rather someone who had learned to replicate it perfectly. It seemed like Alexei's rise to fame was built on more than just raw talent. It was built on the work of someone else. As the months went by, the questions surrounding Alexei grew louder. The more people learned about Lucas Kavanaugh's mysterious disappearance, the more they started to connect the dots. Some began to believe that Alexei was not a self-taught genius, but a man who had spent years studying and perfecting Kavanaugh's work in secret. But if that was true, then who was the real genius? Alexei, who had brought Kavanaugh's music back to life, or Kavanaugh, who had created it in the first place? The tension in the classical music world was palpable. On one hand, Alexei's performances were still breathtaking. He continued to wow audiences with his technical skill and emotional depth. But on the other hand, there was this growing sense that the man behind the music might not be as authentic as he seemed. His rise to fame was starting to feel like a carefully constructed story, one that might not be entirely true. As the investigation continued, more and more people began to question whether Alexei was a true genius or simply a skilled performer who had learned to imitate the greats. The mystery remained unsolved, but one thing was clear: Alexei's story was far from over. As the days passed, the questions surrounding Alexei only grew louder. The media was relentless, digging deeper into his past, and the pressure on him seemed to grow with each new revelation. Fans who once idolized him began to wonder if they had been deceived, and the critics who had once hailed him as a new genius in the classical music world were now more cautious in their praise. Some were even calling for answers, demanding that Alexei finally reveal the truth about where he came from and how he had become so skilled at playing the piano. Through all of this, Alexei remained tight-lipped. He continued to perform, mesmerizing audiences with his remarkable talent. But the world was starting to see a different side of him, one that was more guarded, more distant. The man who had once seemed like a fresh breath of air in the classical music world now appeared like a puzzle. His smile tight, his words few. One evening, during a performance in London, something unexpected happened. After Alexei finished playing a particularly difficult piece, a woman in the front row stood up. She didn't clap. She didn't cheer. Instead, she shouted out, "Is this really your music, or are you just stealing someone else's?" The audience fell silent. It was the first time anyone had dared to confront Alexei in such a direct way. The room was filled with tension as all eyes turned to him. Alexei didn't respond right away. He just stood there motionless, as if processing the question. The woman's words hung in the air like a challenge. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I play the music that moves me," he said softly. "What matters is how it makes you feel. Isn't that what music is about?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, as if he were trying to keep his emotions in check. The woman sat back down, but the impact of her question lingered. It was clear that people were starting to wonder if they had been fooled. Was Alexei simply playing the works of others and passing them off as his own? Or was he truly a musical prodigy, capable of creating something new, something original? The incident in London sparked a wave of conversations across the world. The media picked up on it immediately, and the story spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with people discussing the legitimacy of Alexei's music. Was he a genius or a fraud? Fans were divided. Some defended him, claiming that his performances were still beautiful, still emotional, regardless of who wrote the music. Others began to question his authenticity. How could someone who had supposedly come out of nowhere play with such depth and mastery, without any formal training or history? Amidst the growing speculation, a new voice appeared. This time it wasn't from a critic or a journalist, but from a former colleague of Lucas Kavanaugh, a pianist who had known Kavanaugh before he disappeared. The colleague, who had been silent for many years, finally decided to speak up. She revealed that Lucas Kavanaugh had been obsessed with finding a perfect student, someone who could understand and bring his music to life in a way that no one else could. According to her, Kavanaugh had spent years mentoring a young man in secret. Could that man have been Alexei? The more she spoke, the more it seemed like Alexei's connection to Kavanaugh was deeper than anyone had realized. This pianist, who had once been close to Kavanaugh, revealed that Lucas had left behind a series of unfinished works, compositions that he had never performed publicly. She believed that Alexei had somehow come into possession of these works and had spent years perfecting them in secret. If this was true, then Alexei wasn't just imitating Kavanaugh's music. He was playing pieces that had never been heard by the world before, pieces that were lost to time until Alexei brought them back to life. The theory that Alexei might have been a secret student of Lucas Kavanaugh gained traction quickly. It was the most logical explanation for his sudden rise to fame. If Alexei had learned from Kavanaugh, it would explain how he was able to play with such emotional depth and technical precision. But it also raised new questions. Why had Alexei kept this connection a secret? Why hadn't he revealed the truth about how he had come to play such complex and beautiful music? The more people thought about it, the more the mystery deepened. Was Alexei simply a student who had learned from a master? Or was he trying to pass himself off as a musical genius in his own right? Had he been hiding the truth to protect his reputation? Or was he afraid that people would see him as a fraud if they knew the real story? Despite the growing suspicions, Alexei's performances continued to captivate audiences around the world. His concerts were still sold out within minutes, and his recordings topped the charts. His talent was undeniable, and many still believed in his genius. But the questions surrounding his past only grew louder. As one concert promoter put it, "We all want to believe in the myth of the self-made genius, but the truth is often much more complicated." Behind the scenes, Alexei was feeling the pressure. The constant scrutiny was wearing him down. He had spent so much time cultivating an image of himself as a unique, original artist. But now that image was being questioned at every turn. The weight of the mystery surrounding his past was starting to take its toll. He felt trapped, unable to speak openly about his connection to Lucas Kavanaugh without risking everything he had worked for. And yet, the longer he stayed silent, the more the questions piled up. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. There were moments when Alexei wanted to come clean. He wanted to tell the world that he had indeed studied Kavanaugh's music, that he had spent years learning the compositions that had never been performed, and that he was simply trying to bring those lost works back to life. But every time he thought about revealing the truth, doubt crept in. Would people still love his music if they knew he wasn't the sole creator? Would they see him as a genius or just a clever imposter? The fear of being exposed as a fraud was a constant presence in his mind, and it kept him from speaking up. At the same time, there was a part of Alexei that felt like the world had no right to demand the truth from him. After all, wasn't it the music that mattered most? If people enjoyed his performances, if they were moved by his playing, wasn't that enough? But deep down he knew that the world's love for his music came with an expectation of authenticity. And now, with the truth slowly leaking out, that authenticity was being called into question. As the pressure continued to build, Alexei faced a difficult decision. Would he continue to keep his secret, allowing the rumors and doubts to swirl around him? Or would he come forward and risk everything in order to clear his name? Either way, it seemed that the world would never look at him the same way again. The mystery of Alexei's past had become more than just a question of his musical ability. It had become a question of identity, of trust, and of what it really meant to be a true artist. And as the world waited for an answer, Alexei was left to wonder if the truth would set him free, or destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. As the months passed, the mystery of Alexei's past began to consume him. The whispers of doubt continued to grow louder, and the pressure to confront the truth felt heavier with each passing day. His concerts were still packed, his music still resonated with millions, but the weight of the secret he was carrying was becoming too much to bear. Alexei had never imagined that his rise to fame would come with so many complications. He had worked tirelessly to create a public persona as a self-made genius, someone who had risen from obscurity to become one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation. But now, with the world questioning his authenticity, that persona was starting to crack. In the quiet moments between performances, when he was alone with his thoughts, Alexei wondered if he could ever escape the shadow of the truth. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to consume him. Every note he played on stage, every applause he received, felt like it was built on a foundation of lies. And the more people asked about his past, the more he realized that he could not outrun the truth forever. One evening, after a particularly tense concert in New York, Alexei was sitting in his dressing room staring at the reflection in the mirror. He had just finished playing a piece by Lucas Cavanaugh, the same composer whose music had sparked so much controversy. The performance had been flawless, as always. The audience had loved it, but all Alexei could think about was the question that had been hanging over him for months. Who am I really? He had spent so long crafting his identity as a musical prodigy, a genius who had emerged from nowhere to captivate the world. But now, with the truth about his connection to Cavanaugh slowly leaking out, Alexei was starting to question whether that identity was truly his own. If he had learned from Cavanaugh, if he had spent years studying the music of a forgotten composer, then who was the real genius, him or Cavanaugh? The question gnawed at him. Was he a true artist or just a skilled performer who had learned to imitate someone else's work? And if he was just imitating, could he still call himself a genius? Was it enough to perform with emotion and precision? Or did true genius lie in creating something new, something original? As Alexei sat there in his dressing room, the weight of these questions felt overwhelming. He knew that he couldn't keep running from the truth. The world was demanding answers, and he couldn't hide forever. But there was also a fear inside him, a fear of losing everything he had worked so hard for. If he admitted the truth, would people still respect him? Would they still love his music? Or would they see him as a fraud, a man who had built his career on someone else's work? It wasn't just the public that Alexei was worried about. There were people in his inner circle who had begun to ask tough questions, too. Some of his closest colleagues in the music world were starting to whisper among themselves. They had seen the similarities between Alexei's playing and Cavanaugh's compositions, and some of them were beginning to suspect that Alexei had been hiding something. But Alexei didn't know how to tell them the truth. How could he explain that his rise to fame hadn't been the result of pure genius, but rather a combination of talent and the hidden works of another? As the pressure mounted, Alexei found himself more and more isolated. He no longer had the carefree joy he once felt when playing the piano. Every note seemed weighed down by the burden of his secret. He was still performing, still captivating audiences, but the thrill of being on stage had started to fade. He no longer felt like he was playing for the love of music. He was playing for his survival. Every concert, every performance felt like another chance to prove to the world that he wasn't a fraud. But deep down, he knew that this game of pretending couldn't go on forever. One night after a performance in Los Angeles, Alexei received a letter. It was from the family of Lucas Cavanaugh. They had read the stories that had been circulating about Alexei and were requesting a private meeting. The letter was polite, but there was an undeniable urgency in the words. The Cavanaugh family wanted to speak to Alexei, to hear his side of the story. And for the first time in months, Alexei felt a sense of relief. He knew that this was the moment he had been dreading. But it was also the moment he had been waiting for. For the first time, he had the opportunity to face the truth. He could no longer hide from the questions that had been plaguing him. The meeting took place a few days later in a small, quiet room in a hotel. Alexei arrived early, his nerves on edge. When the Cavanaugh family walked in, he was struck by how ordinary they seemed. They weren't angry or confrontational. They were just a family, grieving, lost in the shadow of a man they had loved and lost. They spoke softly, their words measured. Lucas Cavanaugh's sister was the first to speak. "We know who you are, Alexei," she said gently. "We've seen your performances and we've heard the rumors. We're not here to accuse you. We just want to understand." Alexei felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could finally breathe. The truth was no longer just a burden, it was a conversation. He had the chance to explain himself, to tell his side of the story. And as he began to speak, the weight of the years of silence seemed to lift. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he confessed. "I never intended to deceive anyone. But when I first found Lucas's music, I didn't know what to do with it. His compositions were so beautiful, so powerful. I thought that if I played them the way he would have, I could bring something of his back to life. But I never meant to claim them as my own." Alexei went on to explain how he had stumbled upon Cavanaugh's music years ago, after the composer had disappeared without a trace. He had spent years studying the pieces, learning the intricacies of Cavanaugh's style and perfecting his performances. But as his fame grew, So did the fear of revealing the truth. He was afraid that if people knew the real story, they wouldn't care about the music anymore. They wouldn't care about his performances. They would only see him as a fraud. When Alexei finished speaking, there was a long silence in the room. The Kavanaugh family listened intently, absorbing every word. Finally, Lucas Kavanaugh's sister spoke again. "We understand, Alexei," she said quietly. "We know that you didn't mean any harm. But the music, it's still Lucas's. You've brought his music back to life, and for that we thank you." Tears welled up in Alexei's eyes as he realized that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't being judged. The family understood his intentions. They understood the emotional weight of bringing back a forgotten composer's legacy. And in that moment, Alexei realized that his music had value, not because it was original, but because it had a purpose. It was a bridge between the past and the present, a way of honoring a lost artist. The meeting ended on a bittersweet note. Alexei knew that he could no longer hide behind a facade. He would have to face the world and share his story. But he also knew that he had the support of the Kavanaugh family, and that was enough for him to move forward. In the weeks that followed, Alexei decided to come clean. He spoke openly to the press about his connection to Lucas Kavanaugh and the music he had spent so many years perfecting. It wasn't easy, and there were still critics who questioned his integrity, but there were also fans who supported him, who understood that music was about more than just originality. It was about connection. It was about bringing something beautiful into the world no matter where it came from. And so Alexei's journey continued. He was no longer the mysterious genius who had come out of nowhere. He was a man who had learned from the past, who had brought forgotten music back to life. His story wasn't one of perfect originality, but it was a story of growth, of learning, and of finding a way to honor the artists who came before him. The world would never see Alexei the same way again. But in some ways, that was the best thing that could have happened. He was no longer pretending to be something he wasn't. He was just a man playing music and trying to make sense of the world around him. And in the end, maybe that was enough.